check out the Full Press Hockey Podcast with Jim Biringer, the best in the business. It's going to be great.
Everyone, welcome back to the Full Press NHL Podcast. I'm your host, Jim Biringer, the voice of Full Press Hockey. I'm joined today by writer of Detroit Hockey Now, Bob Duff. Bob, welcome to the program.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Jim.
Hey, big news coming out of the Detroit Red Wings last week. Their two young guys, Moritz Seider and Lucas Raymond, are locked up to long-term deals. Your initial thoughts on the contracts when they were announced?
It's about where we figured they would slot in. You always wonder why these things take so long, because you can pretty much map out, the ballpark range of where they're going to end up. And you almost wonder, is this just part of the game? Is it all posturing? And could they have had this done in July if they really wanted to?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, you look at with training camp opening this week and last week as well, when they missed a couple of days and the preseason action is underway. How important was it for Steve Yzerman and the Detroit Red Wings to get them in, especially with what the expectations are for the Red Wings this year?
I think it was very important. And even, Seider did miss the 4 days in Traverse City. He was back on the ice for the first time today, actually. And, you think that's not a big deal, but those 4 days of starting in training camp where you get the systems down, you get the drills, to get you back into kind of conditioned to ready to play games, he didn't get that. So he's already a little bit behind the eight ball. Now he's a young guy, so it probably won't take him much to get back up to speed. And as Derek Lalonde said, he's got a number of assistant coaches that'll be quite willing to help him get there. And read that as he's going to be doing a lot of bag skating in the next couple of days.
Yeah, no, I mean, you look at it and, when I was writing and analyzing, the Detroit Red Wings situation with their two RFAs, and I look at what happened with Anaheim last year with their two RFAs, Jamie Drysdale obviously is now in Philadelphia, and we don't know what Trevor Zegras' future is with the Anaheim Ducks. Obviously, he's still signed. But I looked at it and I said, Steve Yzerman's a smart guy. He understands that he doesn't want it to drag it as long as it did with Anaheim, especially with young guys. You want them in, and especially with Detroit, like trying to make the playoffs this year, you don't want to play catch up. And I think that's when injuries happen. That's just my opinion from the outside. I don't know what you're thinking here.
Well, I look at the last guy who held out on the Red Wings and missed part of the season was Andreas Athanasiou one year, and he never could get back up to speed. He really took him half the season to get going. And so, as you say, they're trying to get in the playoffs, and those are two guys that are vital to that operation. If Raymond and Seider have bad seasons, this team's not got any hope of making the playoffs.
Well, we saw what Raymond did last year. Was it 23 points in his final 18 games? I mean, Detroit got as close as to making the playoffs without even getting in last year, just because of tiebreakers. Is the expectation for this group to make the playoffs, or what's the marker for improvement this year? Is it the playoffs for Detroit?
I think it is. From the outside, the expectations of the fan base certainly are that, that's the next step. They kind of 2 years ago made that step into where they were no longer that weak rebuilding team to a team that was a formidable foe. And, for a brief time looked like they might flirt with a playoff berth, to last year where they, put it all together and made that charge and, came up as close as you can to getting in without getting in. So, I mean, logically, the next step is to get in. Now, that being said, there were a number of players who left during the offseason. You think of Robbie Fabry, David Perron, Shane Gostisbehere, who was so vital to the power play. They've got to replace those pieces, and, they think they have done that, and time will tell if they have. I kind of look at it years ago when the Wings had that 62-win season. The next season they came back, and I wouldn't say they struggled in the regular season, but they certainly weren't at that level again. And I remember having a conversation with Steve Yzerman, who was the captain of the team back then, and about their struggles. And this was at around the All-Star break. And he said, this team has got a better chance to win the Stanley Cup than last year's team, which, kind of surprised me to hear him say that when they were not playing anywhere near at that level. And then when they actually did get to the finals to play the Flyers, I asked him, I said, you remember we had that conversation? And he said, I said to him, what gave you that kind of faith that this team could get here? And he said, we had restructured the team. We had better pieces in place to make a playoff run. He said that the trouble with the 95-96 team was they had too many of the same type of players. A lot of scoring, a lot of offense, high octane team, but really no plan B when things got tough. And, in the 97 team, you had guys like Marty Lapointe and Darren McCarty, and Brendan Shanahan, and even they brought in Thomas Sandstrom. They had a lot of sandpaper and grit on that team, along with still having high octane skill. And I look at what they've done this offseason. They brought in a guy like Tyler Mott, who certainly wasn't a sexy free agent signing, but solid fourth line player, gets 100 hits every year. You start looking through their lineup, and Derek Lalonde has talked about this, that guys slot more naturally into their roles this year than last year. You look at their fourth line last year. I don't know there's a fourth line in the NHL that got more goals than Detroit's fourth line between Robbie Fabry and Daniel Sprong and Joe Veleno. But they didn't make the playoffs. So, maybe Yzerman, the GM's onto the same kind of formula that Yzerman, the captain, saw. And he's put a team together that might not look as exciting on paper, but maybe has the formula to make the playoffs.
And you mentioned like the depth of this team, and you talk about the lines and trying to add that sandpaper. And you mentioned like Mo Seider and Lucas Raymond are a key to this team making the playoffs. Seider, we see him always. He's lauded as the number one defenseman on this team. Who do you think he's paired with going into the regular season, and will it change?
Well, interesting. You should bring that up because Derek Lalonde was talking about that just yesterday, and he strongly hinted that if Simon Edvinsson does what they think he's capable of doing, they have no problem putting him and Seider together in a pairing and playing them as their top pair, which would really be, the fan base has kind of been craving that. And I think Ben Sherratt probably starts the season with Seider, the same they finished last year, and Jeff Petrie with Edvinsson, because Petrie has proven to be a really good mentor for Edvinsson. But I think as Edvinsson gets his feet under him and, solidifies himself as an NHL regular, if he's playing to the potential that people think he can, I wouldn't be surprised to see him and Seider. And Lalonde said, my pairings are going to be fluid, and we're going to, whoever's on that night, that's the guys that are going to get the minutes. And he says, if that's Edvinsson, he'll get the minutes.
Wow, that's really interesting, because I know there's been a lot of high praise of Simon Edvinsson in Detroit. And there was a lot of talk about him potentially doing it last year. And obviously there's always a growing period. In Detroit, I love Detroit because going back into the 90s and the 2000s when they won their cups, they remind me of New Jersey so much because of the development, the drafting, the players, they take their time with their players, and you're seeing it. Obviously, Seider is a different animal. Raymond's a different animal. But even those guys had their developmental time, and they feel like when they came to the National Hockey League, they've always are ready. It seems like Detroit's running that machine constantly still.
Yeah, and when you talk about importance of getting them into camp, I think the guy that they had to get signed and get here right from the start was Jonathan Berggren, because he's going to play a pretty vital role this year. They've lost a lot of goals, and he's a guy who's scored. If you put his NHL numbers together, he's had in his career 17 goals over 80 games. Basically one full season. And they need him to produce at that level because they lost Fabry, who had 18 goals. They've lost Sprong, who had 18 goals. David Perron, who had, I think he had 17 goals. There's a lot of goals that went out the window. And even if you factor in 12 from Jake Wallman and 10 from Gostisbehere on the defense, they've lost about 75 goals. So some of that they hope to make up internally, and Berggren is certainly one of those guys that could deliver that kind of potential.
You mentioned Wallman. Was that just a cap casualty move to move out Jake Wallman, or is it just something that just had to be done? And did they really want to lose him?
I think there were some issues with him toward the end of last season. He didn't take his demotion very well. I've heard from some sources around the team that when he was sat out and was a healthy scratch toward the end of the year, he wasn't a team guy, let's say. He was kind of grousing and complaining about he should be in there. And that, I think, might have sealed his fate. But ultimately, it was a cap move. They had to move out some money. And they tried like the Dickens to make it Justin Hall, but they couldn't find any takers. So they had to find a defenseman that, they could, fit the window they wanted to create in terms of cap room and also someone that a team was willing to take. And even at that, they had to throw in a second round pick, and Andrew Gibson, a player that the team actually really likes. And from everything I've heard from Nashville, who got him, they really are excited about his potential. And, that's the guy. Now, granted, they do have a lot of defensive prospects, so they could probably afford to lose one. But, it could come back to haunt them if Andrew Gibson becomes a really solid NHL defenseman.
Yeah, I mean, Justin Hall, I mean, it feels like he's a solid, defenseman. I mean, even when he signed there, I was like, oh, that's a little high because, he was in Toronto and, everybody makes a big deal about the center of the hockey world. Then he comes there, but, he seems to be he's a depth defenseman, third pairing guy for this team. But the money he's making, it says you want a little bit more out of that guy. But again, that's what he is. And I know everybody picks on a certain player. And I guess Justin Hall is that guy in Detroit.
Yeah, I mean, he's certainly, the fact that he really didn't play in the second half of last year has kind of solidified him in that role. Like people think if he's in the lineup, then something's gone wrong. But, he's kind of, in baseball, you have left-handed pitchers always seem to find a taker. I think it's the same with right shot defensemen. There's always going to be some team that will sign them if they're out there. Now, it's going to be interesting to see how he fits into the picture because, they've lost some right shot defensemen now. Eric Gustafsson, who they signed and they're hoping will be the guy that can replace Gostisbehere running the first power play unit. He's a guy who's played a lot on his offside, even though he's a left shot. So they're kind of confident that he can fill that role. But, really other than Hull, the only other right shot defenseman they have is Seider. So, Hull is there. And the one thing last year that was really bizarre because it just doesn't happen in the NHL. They had 8 NHL defensemen and none of them ever got hurt. You just never see a season where your 8 defensemen stay healthy all year long. Like the year before they had 8 defensemen and it always seemed like 2 of them were hurt. So they never really had to decide who was playing that night. But last year there was really no long-term injuries on the defense. And what are the odds that happens 2 years in a row in the NHL? I'd say it's pretty slim.
Yeah, I would say so. And health is always a big question mark for the Detroit Red Wings because, let's be honest, Dylan Larkin stays healthy down the stretch. The Detroit Red Wings are probably in the Stanley Cup playoffs last year. And they went 4-10 without him in the regular season last year. I think that's a big player for them this year. He's got to stay healthy, and you get a full season of Patrick Kane, Alex DeBrincat, and Vladimir Tarasenko mixes in with that group. I think that's a nice forward group for this team.
Yeah, it's an interesting top 6 because 5 of the 6 have scored at least 30 goals in an NHL season at least one time. And, you look at, what does a full season of Patrick Kane look like? He had 20 goals in 50 games. If you prorate that, that's a 30-goal season over a full season. And, he's healthy now too. Like last year, he still had it in the back of his mind, am I going to be able to do this? Well, now he knows he can do it. So he's probably going to be a little more emboldened, I would think, this year because he's starting, he's not starting off with question marks in his mind about his future. And, DeBrincat, if you look at his career numbers, his shooting percentage in other seasons was much higher than last year. I don't know. It's too bad they don't keep the stat because I bet you he led the league in hitting goalposts last year. I never saw a guy hit higher in one season than him last year. And you wonder, if those 5 or 6 of those go the other way off the post and into the net, suddenly he's got like 32, 33 goals. Now, it's probably not fair to expect him to get 41 like he did twice in Chicago, but I don't think it's out of the question to expect him to be in the low to mid 30s.
No, I don't expect so either, especially with his running buddy there now. And then, Patrick Kane's back. And like I said, Vladimir Tarasenko, you had a 2-time Stanley Cup champion now. Look, he was a mentor for those guys down in Florida on the third line, and he could still run a power play. Like, he could still be on your second power play unit. I think Derek Lalonde has a lot of options when it comes to his power play, and especially his forward group. And I always love the additions of Andrew Kopp and JT Compher. I thought those guys were great. And it seems like they have a lot of depth. And like you said earlier in the program, they have that sandpaper, they have that grit, and the lessons that they've learned over the last couple of years could potentially get them into the playoffs this year.
Yeah, I think their 2 biggest question marks are going to be their defensive depth. Even their top 4, if one of those guys got hurt long term, and you wonder, Petrie and Sherrod are another year older, how effective are they going to be? And then if they're not, then who moves into those slots? You've got Ollie Mata, you've got Gustafsson. Gustafsson's going to play every night because they need him on the power play, but he's probably going to be in their third pairing. And the question seems to be who's going to be that sixth defenseman. And you got three guys. You got Ollie Mata, you got Justin Holl, and then the guy that's curious, and the Wings are talking him up big in so far in camp, is Albert Johansson. One of their draft picks. He's never played in the NHL. He's spent the last 2 seasons in the AHL with Grand Rapids. He's not going to be a star. He's going to be one of those guys who plays in the third pairing and just doesn't make mistakes and doesn't get you into trouble. So if he can give them, say 15 minutes a night where they don't get scored on, then that's a pretty reliable third pairing defenseman.
Are there any young guys up front, or is the forward group pretty much set? Are there any guys that can make this lineup that coming out from like the AHL or some young draft picks that can come and make this lineup, or is the forward group pretty much set already?
I think on paper it's pretty much set, but certainly if there's Nate Danielson, there's Marco Kasper, and probably the third guy with a shot would be Carter Mazer. They'd have to have an incredible preseason to make it happen because they do have basically 12 NHL forwards signed, and then you've got 2 pretty reliable veterans on PTOs in Austin Watson and Alex Chason, who either of them could end up signing with the team. But I think that they want those kids to play, but they probably need another year in Grand Rapids. But I would say this, if they do get injuries at forward, that's the guys I think you'll see coming up to play because they do believe that all 3 of them are going to be solid NHLers.
So obviously we talked about the injury to Larkin last year, but the biggest question mark I was looking at last year, when it came to the Detroit Red Wings, goaltending. It seems like they ran with a 3-headed monster last year. It looks like they may be doing it again. You have Cam Talbot in there, Alex Lyons in there, Ville Husso. They signed Jack Campbell. There's like 6 goalies on the roster. I know Sebastian Cossa is their big prospect that they want to try to get some time. Who's the guy, and are they going to run with 3 goalies again?
I think they will to start if they're all healthy. I mean, the real concern, and Steve Yzerman admitted this when I asked him, is they don't know what they're going to get from Ville Husso. He really hasn't played a game since last December. He tried twice and didn't. First time he didn't make it through the first period. The second time he didn't make it through the warm-up. So you don't know. Could you risk going into the season with him and Alex Lyon as your goalies if you want to make the playoffs? And they decided, no, we can't. And that's why they brought in Cam Talbot. And to me, I think Cam Talbot's probably going to be the guy. He's coming off an all-star season. He's been a workhorse throughout his career. The thing about Alex Lyon, he played very well, and he certainly saved their season last year when he came in when Husso and Reimer got hurt. But he ran out of gas down the stretch, and he'd never played that kind of workload in his pro career. Even in the minors, he hadn't played at that level. So I think he just ran out of steam toward the end. So I think in their ideal world, they would like to see Talbot play between 45 and 50, and then either Lyon or Husso pick up the slack. And I would imagine if Husso shows he's healthy, they may try to move him because he's got a big contract and he's in the last year. And I know there's teams like Columbus looking for a goalie. So maybe you could convince them, even if you had to keep some of his salary, that he's a guy that they should take a flyer on.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting because it seems like if you don't have a goalie or you have too many goalies, you don't have a goalie. Like there's only like so many number 1 spots. Detroit, when they won their cups, I mean, yeah, Mike Vernon, Chris Osgood, they had Dominik Hasek, but they always seem to get it done with defense and offense, and they had depth, and they just got the timely save. And, it reminds me, it seems like that's what they're doing again. It seems like Steve Yzerman is taking that plan from the 90s that Holland had, and it seems like it's the same system over and over again here with the Detroit Red Wings. It's something that you touched on earlier. Yeah,
he's adopted a lot of Holland's policies, like the letting the kids ripen on the vine, as they say, was Holland's saying, and Yzerman seems to have gone that way, which is a little bit surprising because if you look in Tampa Bay, they had some of those kids up pretty fast, like Braden Point and Kucherov didn't see much time at all in the minors, and even Vasilevsky wasn't there that long. So, but he's been much more patient with these guys. And, maybe that says something to where they had to draft. Like they really, other than Raymond That's the only pick they've had in the top 5 since Yzerman took over. So they really haven't had that shot to get kind of that franchise-changing player like a Connor Bedard or a Connor McDavid. They haven't been able to get that high up in the draft where they could get one of those guys. And I'm sure if they were able to get one of those guys, he wouldn't be playing in Grand Rapids.
No, they would not be playing in Grand Rapids. I mean, like, again, Seider does stuff like in his rookie year when he won the Calder, like Nick Lindstrom did, putting up 50 points in a season. The last couple of years with Seider, I know he came back a little bit, 42 points those last couple of years. Do they expect him to be a 50-point player, maybe a little bit more, or do they feel like he's more of a defensive defenseman with some offensive flair?
I think, and he thinks too, that he can deliver more offense. He has averaged around 40 points and about 8 or 9 goals every year. But last year, he really didn't get any first unit power play time because Gostisbehere had that role. And they usually went with 1D and 4 forwards, which I assume they're going to do again this year. So it'll be interesting to see how much power play time they give Seider. They do see a lot of value in him as a shutdown guy and as a penalty killer. So it could be that Gustafsson will ride the power play and then they'll use Seider to play the defensive minutes and the shutdown minutes and the penalty killing, and he'll probably get time with the second power play unit.
Detroit, we keep mentioning the playoffs. We talk about the expectations. What's the mindset from the players this year? Is it playoffs, or have they been talking about it, or they're just saying, hey, we're just taking it one game at a time and we're just going to play out the season and see what happens? Like, what's their mindset going into this year?
They don't specifically say playoffs or bust, but just reading between the lines, they all talk about, we understand that the expectations are higher now. Well, if you miss the playoffs in a tiebreaker, the next level is to make it. So if the expectations are higher, then that's what everyone's expecting. And so I think definitely if they don't make the playoffs this year, it'll be the most disappointing season, because I think last year people were excited in Detroit that they had a chance to get in, but they were disappointed that they didn't get in, but they weren't devastated. If they don't get in this year, I think people will be devastated, and then you'll start to hear complaints about the Yzerman rebuild not working. And in the next couple of years, I think are really going to be interesting for this team, because we've slowly seen the transition, and it pretty much is Yzerman's team now. There's still a few guys like Berggren and Veleno and Rasmussen who were drafted in the Ken Holland era. But for the most part, this team is Steve Yzerman players now. And either free agents he's signed, guys he's traded for, guys he's drafted. And there's a whole cache of draft picks in Grand Rapids and in Europe that are on their way, on the cusp of being here. So it's really going to become his team in the next couple of years. And if they aren't be a playoff team by then I think there's going to be a lot of angst in this town.
Yeah, I mean, everybody wants Hockey Town to be back in the playoffs. I mean, I think there was a lot of hopefulness and a lot of wishing from outside of Detroit last year when you were watching that snail race in the Eastern Conference for who wanted to get into that last playoff spot. I was pulling for Detroit myself, no bias there, but I was like, let's see if Detroit can get in there, because you'd love to see Hockey Town back in the playoffs. They finished with 91 points. Does that get them in this year, or do you think they have to go higher, maybe like 94, 95 points?
Probably a little bit higher, I would think. I mean, you look back to, was it 2 years ago when every team in the East had 100 to get in? So, and the other problem you look at is, for them to get in, somebody's going to have to be out. And the other thing I think is, like, the Devils, I think, are going to be back in. I mean, they had just a horrific season last year. That team's too good to stay down there. And, they've addressed the issue in goal. So I would think, if you're slotting in the 8 playoff teams in the East, I think you got to count the Devils as in. So now you're looking at maybe only one spot being up for grabs, because you start looking at, maybe you can make a case for the Islanders missing, but the Islanders always seem to find that way to get in. And then I think the most susceptible team would be Washington, because they certainly look like a team that's in decline. A lot of their the core from their Stanley Cup years is either breaking down or departing. And, that to me is a team that, if you're targeting one that's not going to be in that was in last year, it would be them.
Yeah, and then you look at the Atlantic Division itself. I mean, that's just a tough division up and down. I mean, you still have Toronto there, the defending Cup champs, Florida. Boston, question marks with Swayman. If he gets in, Boston's never easy. Tampa Bay, I mean, do they take a step back? Obviously, Montreal's coming, Ottawa's coming, and then Buffalo's there, and Detroit's right in that cuffs. Last year we talked about Ottawa, Buffalo, Detroit, who could take that next step. Detroit was the closest. It feels like if they can get in, maybe they take out somebody like Tampa or Boston in the Atlantic Division, but it's not going to be easy.
Yeah. I mean, every year you look at Boston and you think, is this the year they finally start to decline? And they always seem to find a way to get it done. But yeah, if they don't get the Swayman situation solved quickly, then I think they become very susceptible.
Yeah, I mean, Tampa too, right? I mean, it feels like they got, even with Stamkos not there, I know you bring in Jake Getzel, but you bring back Ryan McDonough. I know he's a solid defenseman, but he's a little older. You take on $6.75 million. That body, I know he's in his 30s, but it feels like he's playing with a body of a 40-year-old because of the way he blocks shots, the injuries that he's had. It just feels like what's that room going to be like down in Tampa too? Because I know they're motivated, but Detroit's coming, and I know they've always played Tampa Bay tough, that Detroit Red Wings team.
Yeah, I mean, Tampa Bay's another one I look at, but then you look around, they still got Vasilevsky, they still got Kucherov, they still got Point, they still got Hedman.
Yeah.
A lot of quality players. It's just hard to see them not being in the playoffs.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I agree with you on New Jersey. I think they should be in. Like, if you're penciling teams in from the Metro, I think New Jersey, the Rangers, probably Carolina, and then is that it? And 5 teams come out of the Atlantic. It's gonna be a very interesting season. And Detroit, is one of those teams everybody's watching to see if they can make the playoffs and get back into it, because there was a time it seemed like Buffalo, New Jersey, Detroit were always in, and Detroit just winning cups and that pedigree of winning. It's been a long time for Detroit. 2016 was the last playoff spot.
Yeah, and there's only one guy left playing professional hockey who won a Stanley Cup with the Red Wings, and that's Valtteri Filppula, who's playing in Finland. So, to think about, that really tells you how long it's been when there's just one active player left from your last Cup winner.
Yeah, that definitely. Before we get you out of here, one burning question for the Detroit Red Wings this year. What is it?
Can they keep the puck out of their net? I mean, when you look at their stretch drive, as exciting as it was, you look at the scores of a lot of those games, 6-5, 5-4. You just can't keep asking your offense to give you 5 or 6 goals every night in order to win. They've got to clamp down. Like, that's one of the ways they've talked about, making up for the missing goals, is to just not give up as many. And the concern is they've talked about that for both years that Derek Lalonde's been the coach. And, the theory hasn't been put into practice. They've got to show that they can keep the puck out of their net consistently. And if they can't do that, they aren't going to be a playoff team.
I totally agree with you. I think that is the biggest concern. Obviously, you want your goalies to stop the puck, but you also have to play better defense in front of your goaltenders. And that was an issue for New Jersey last year. I know that for a fact. So I definitely agree with you that Detroit definitely play a little bit better defense, helps the transition with your offense, and everybody is on the same page. I expect Detroit to be in the playoffs. Hopefully they do get in. But Bob Duff, your thoughts on playoff spot this year for Detroit?
If you'd asked me 2 months ago, I would have said no. But now I look at what they've done to the roster, and I think the moves they made were in order to try to be a more responsible team and not give up as many goals. They might not, be as high potency in terms of scoring this year, but maybe, winning 3-2 is more exciting than losing 6-5.
I love it. Great place to end it. Bob Duff, Detroit Hockey Now, joining the Full Press NHL podcast. Bob, thank you so much.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, Jim.
Hey, guys, Full Press NHL podcast up on YouTube. Also, iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Guys, take care. Enjoy the preseason.
Barry Trought's Nashville Predators, making sure you're listening to Full Press Hockey Podcast.